The horses felt it first, the storm, the shift, the something waiting in the air. Across the plantation yard, every eye was fixed on the cedar post as a young woman walked toward it, without tears, without struggle, without fear. They thought they were about to witness a punishment. They thought they were about to see her break. But what they didn't know was this. Before the rain stopped falling, a secret buried for 20 years would rise to the surface, and nothing on that plantation would ever be the same again. Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture a summer afternoon in South Carolina. The year is 1847. The air sits heavy and hot like a wet blanket pressed against your face. It smells of red clay dirt, of wood smoke from the cookhouse, of something sweet and rotting from the fields. Sugarcane, maybe, or the last bruised peaches of the season left uncollected on the ground. Cicadas scream from the tree line. The sky, which had been a flat, breathless white all morning, has begun to darken in the west. Those clouds don't look like rain yet. They look like a bruise. Now listen. In the distance, beyond the fields, somewhere in the dark tangle of the live oaks, a mockingbird is running through its entire repertoire, 4, 5, 6 different songs in rapid succession, as if it knows something is about to change and is trying to say everything at once before the silence comes. The horses in the stable are restless, shifting and stamping. The dog that usually sleeps on the gallery steps is nowhere to be seen. Animals have a way of feeling what's coming before it arrives. And in the center of the Whitmore plantation yard, where the hard-packed earth has been worn smooth by years of footsteps, of shuffling, of marching, of dragging, there is a post. It's a thick cedar post, weathered to silver gray, driven deep into the ground. Nothing grand about it, nothing remarkable, but every single person on that plantation knows what it is. The enslaved people call it, in whispers, the tree that doesn't forgive. There is a young woman being led toward it right now. Her name is Celestine, but most people just call her Celia. She is 22 years old. She has wide, dark eyes that always seem to be thinking about something far away from wherever she is. She walks with her hands bound in front of her, not running, not crying, not fighting, just walking. Her face is composed in a way that frightens some of the watching overseers more than tears would. One of the enslaved men watching from the edge of the field whispers to the man beside him that she looks like someone who has already decided something. He doesn't know what that means. He just knows it's true. The overseer, a thick-necked man named Garrett Hobbs, follows behind her. He is holding a coiled leather strap. The sentence has already been handed down by the master of the house himself, Edmund Whitmore. 100 lashes, administered publicly as a warning to every soul on the property. The charge? Theft. Silver candlesticks missing from the main house. But here is the thing about that charge, the thing that matters, and I want you to hold on to this as we go deeper into this story. Celia did not steal those candlesticks. And the rain, when it finally comes, will prove something far more extraordinary than her innocence. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, of course she didn't steal them. And you're right to think that. But the truth I'm about to share with you is stranger and more devastating than a simple story of false accusation. What the rain reveals on Celia's skin that afternoon will tear open the foundations of the Whitmore household, expose a secret buried for more than 2 decades, and force every single person on that plantation, enslaved and free, to reckon with something they had all, in their own ways, been trying not to see. This is her story. And it begins, as so many of the most important stories do, not in the place where the crisis happens, but far away, years earlier, in a life that was stolen. You see, Celia was not born into slavery. Let that settle for just a second. She was not born into it. She was taken into it. And that distinction, small as it might sound when you first hear it, is the very axis on which this entire story turns. She was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1825. Her mother, a free woman of color named Dorothea Eames, worked as a seamstress in a modest but respectable boarding house near the waterfront. Dorothea was a careful woman, disciplined. She kept her rooms clean, her ledger balanced, her affairs quiet and orderly, in the way that free black people in the North often had to keep everything, quietly, carefully, always aware that the wrong glance from the wrong person could dismantle everything you'd built. But Dorothea also loved fiercely, and when Celia was born, small, bright-eyed, honey-brown in complexion, Dorothea poured every ounce of that fierce love into raising her. She taught Celia to read by candlelight, whispering the letters while Celia traced them on scraps of fabric. She taught her French words and Bible verses and how to sew a straight seam and how to look a person in the eye without flinching. "Your eyes," Dorothea used to tell her daughter, "are free. Don't ever let them forget that." Celia's father was a white merchant named Thomas Hargrove, a man of some means and very little courage. He and Dorothea had a private understanding for several years, one of those arrangements that existed in the shadow spaces of Philadelphia society, acknowledged by neither party in public, sustained by a combination of genuine feeling and mutual convenience. Thomas Hargrove gave Dorothea money when he could. He visited on Wednesday evenings. He brought sweets for Celia and called her "my little bird," with a tenderness that was real, even if it was also bounded by cowardice. He never acknowledged her publicly. He never put his name on any document that linked him to her. But he was there. For a while, he was there. And then, in 1835, when Celia was 10 years old, Thomas Hargrove married a woman from Baltimore named Carolyn Fells, moved to a large house on Spruce Street, and gradually, painfully, stopped coming on Wednesday evenings. The sweets stopped, the visits stopped, the money became irregular, then sparse, then nothing at all. Dorothea did not rage. She did not go to his house on Spruce Street. She simply adjusted. She took in more sewing. She rented out the spare room in the boarding house to a quiet schoolteacher from Delaware. She held her chin up, and she kept going. But here is the small, heartbreaking detail I want you to sit with for a moment. Every Wednesday evening for 3 years after Thomas Hargrove stopped coming, Celia sat by the window anyway, not visibly waiting, just there, sewing or reading or watching the street below. Her mother never said anything about it, and Celia never admitted she was waiting. But Dorothea knew, and Celia knew she knew, and neither of them ever spoke about the empty Wednesday evenings, because some grief is too tender to name. That detail matters, because it tells you what kind of person Celia was, someone who felt things deeply and endured them quietly, someone whose silence was not emptiness, but depth. Now, life continued. Celia grew into a young woman. By 1841, she was 16, tall and slender, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's coloring, lighter than Dorothea, light enough that strangers sometimes looked at her twice, trying to place her. In the free northern states, this was not unusual. There were many people whose lives existed in the complicated gradations between defined racial categories, and Philadelphia, for all its hypocrisies, had enough of a free black community that Celia knew who she was and where she belonged. She had her papers. This is important. She had her freedom papers, a certificate that Dorothea had obtained years earlier, signed by a justice of the peace, stating clearly that Celestine Eames was a free person of color, born free, citizen of Pennsylvania. Dorothea kept the original in a tin box under the floorboards. Celia carried a copy, folded small, tucked into the lining of her coat. Those papers were her life. She knew that. Philadelphia was not the Deep South, but the Fugitive Slave Act cast long shadows even in the North, and there were men, professional slave catchers, opportunists, men who made their living in the gray zones of the law, who would seize a light-skinned black person on the streets and claim they were a runaway enslaved woman. It happened. Celia had heard the stories. Dorothea had made sure of that. So she carried her papers. She was careful. She was smart. And then, in October of 1841, she made a single, ordinary mistake. She went to the market alone. Dorothea was ill, nothing serious, a winter chest cold that had settled in for a few weeks. She needed black pepper and ginger root and a particular kind of dried chamomile that a vendor at the south end of the market sold. Celia had been to that market 100 times. She knew exactly where the vendor was. She expected to be gone less than an hour. She left her papers at home because she was only going to the market. You see how it happens. You see how ordinary it is. Not a dramatic moment, not a moment she would have marked in her memory as significant. Just a Tuesday morning errand, coat buttoned against the autumn cold, basket over her arm. Just the kind of errand anyone might run. Two men grabbed her between the cheese stall and the herb vendor. It was fast and practiced, the kind of thing they'd clearly done before. One grabbed her arms from behind, the other flashed a paper, a document claiming she was a runaway enslaved woman named Pearl from a plantation in Virginia. They said it loud enough for the people around her to hear. They said it with the total confidence of men who knew that a young black girl screaming in a market would not, in the end, be believed over their official-looking paper. She screamed. She fought. She told them her name, told them her mother's name, told them exactly where she lived and who could vouch for her. A few bystanders hesitated. A white woman in a gray coat started toward her with an expression of uncertainty on her face, that awful, pivotal uncertainty that is the exact moment when history could have turned differently. But one of the men said something sharp and dismissive to the woman, and the woman stopped. And then Celia was in the back of a covered wagon, and the cover came down, and the market sounds faded, and Philadelphia was gone. She was 16 years old. And before I put you in that wagon with her, I need to tell you something about the world that made this possible, because there is a tendency when we talk about American slavery to imagine a clean line, enslaved people in the South, free people in the North, and that line existed on paper, in law, in the rhetoric of freedom that the northern states draped around themselves like a respectable coat. But the actual lived reality was far more permeable, far more terrifying, and far more lawless than that clean line suggests. The kidnapping of free black people in the North, taking them by force south into slavery, was not a rare aberration. It was a business. There were professional networks for it, men who knew the roads, the hiding places, the river crossings, the corrupt officials who could be paid to look the other way. There were fake legal documents, printed in bulk that could be produced on demand to transform any free black person on any northern street into a runaway slave with a Georgia or South Carolina or Virginia master waiting for them. The documents looked official because they were designed to. The men who carried them had done this dozens of times. Historians estimate that in the decades before the Civil War, thousands of free black people were taken this way, kidnapped off northern streets, dragged south, sold into bondage, their identities erased, their families left without any idea of what had happened or where they had gone. Most of them were never found. Most of them left behind families who spent years, sometimes entire lifetimes, making inquiries that led nowhere, looking for names in records that did not exist, waiting for letters that never came. The particular cruelty of this particular crime, beyond the obvious and total violation of a person's freedom, was what it did to the family left behind. When an enslaved person in the South was sold away, the family knew something. They knew where the person had been taken from, if not where they were going. They had the terrible comfort of knowing what had happened. But when a free person was kidnapped, the family had nothing. Dorothea Eames did not know for 6 years whether her daughter had run away, been murdered, had an accident, drowned in the Delaware, or the worst possibility, the one she could not quite let herself believe, been taken south. She did not know. And that not knowing, that suspension in total uncertainty, is a specific kind of suffering that deserves its own name. I want you to hold that image of Dorothea for a moment before we continue. Hold her in the boarding house near the waterfront. Hold the Tuesday morning when she got up from her sickbed and realized her daughter had not come home from the market. Hold the first hour, probably still hoping, telling herself the girl had simply stopped somewhere, had met a friend, was being cautious. Hold the second hour, the third. the moment when hope curdled into something else, the moment she put on her coat and went to the market herself, still weak from the cold, and found nothing, nothing but the ordinary market continuing its ordinary Tuesday business around the hole where her daughter had been. Hold that, and then understand why the tin box never moved. I want you to sit in that wagon with her for just a moment. I want you to feel the dark of it, the rough boards beneath her, the swaying of the wheels on the cobblestones, the way the sounds of the city gradually gave way to the open road. She was still fighting at first, kicking at the boards, screaming until her voice broke. And then she was crying, and then she was quiet. And in that quiet, she did something that tells you everything about who this young woman was. She started memorizing. The turns the wagon made, the sounds she could identify, the smell of the air changing as they moved south and west. She began even in that moment to gather information, because somewhere in the back of her mind, even at 16, even in the darkest moment of her life, a part of her was already planning to get out. She was sold 3 times before she reached South Carolina. Each sale was faster than the last, each buyer's face a little harder, the transaction a little more perfunctory. By the time she arrived at Whitmore Plantation near Beaufort in the spring of 1842, she had been on the road for almost 6 months, had passed through the hands of traders who never once asked her name, and had learned a kind of internal armor that was not quite numbness, because numbness is passive, but something more like a deliberate withdrawal. She was present, she was watching, she was alive in the parts of herself that couldn't be bought or sold, but she kept those parts very, very still. Now here is where I need to tell you about something Celia did in those first weeks at Whitmore Plantation, something that seemed at the time like a small and practical decision, something that would ultimately lead, 6 years later, to her standing at that cedar post in the rain.
You see, Celia's complexion was a problem. Not for the reasons you might first think. Yes, lighter-skinned enslaved women were often subjected to particular cruelties from the plantation mistress, jealousies, persecutions, the kind of violence that comes from women trapped in an impossible system taking their pain out sideways. But that wasn't Celia's immediate fear. Her immediate fear was simpler and more specific. She was afraid of being recognized. She had been sold as a runaway slave named Pearl from Virginia. That fiction had to hold. But her papers, somewhere in Philadelphia, in a tin box under Dorothea's floorboards, told a different story. If anyone looked too carefully at her coloring, thought too carefully about her speech, which still carried the flat vowels of Philadelphia, noticed that she read when she thought no one was watching, any of those threads could unravel the story her captors had sold along with her. So she made herself darker. Walnut hulls. The black outer shells of walnuts, which grow abundantly throughout the American South, produce a powerful natural dye, a deep brown stain that has been used for centuries to color wood, fabric, and yes, skin. Celia began collecting them quietly, crushing them, making a paste, applying it carefully and consistently to her face, her neck, her arms, every visible surface. The process was painstaking. It had to be touched up regularly. It had to be maintained, but it worked. And here is the tragic irony. The very act of disguising herself, the very thing she did to protect herself, to survive, to keep her secret, is what made everything that came later possible. Because if Celia had not darkened her skin, the truth might have been noticed years earlier, might have been complicated earlier. Instead, the secret was preserved, kept, compressed under pressure, until one afternoon in August of 1847, when the sky opened up and the rain came down and washed 6 years of careful disguise away in a matter of minutes. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what those 6 years were like, because they were not simply years of suffering, though there was suffering, real and constant. They were also years of a kind of interior life that Celia built with tremendous care, like a garden inside a prison. And you need to understand that garden before you can understand what the rain revealed. The Whitmore plantation was a large cotton and indigo operation, about 800 acres of low country, threaded through with rivers and salt marsh and dense cathedral-like stands of live oak dripping with Spanish moss. There were, at the time of our story, approximately 60 enslaved people living and working on the property. Edmund Whitmore was the master, a man in his late 50s by 1847, gray-haired, prosperous, possessed of that particular brand of Southern gentleman's self-certainty that allowed men like him to hold entire human communities in bondage without apparently losing a night's sleep over it. He was not the worst master in Beaufort County. I want to be honest about this, the same way I want to be honest about Catherine, not because it excuses anything, but because the nuances of this particular horror matter. He was not a sadist. He did not take pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. He ran his operation efficiently and believed with complete sincerity in the justice and necessity of what he was doing. He had been taught to believe it, had been surrounded from birth by a society that confirmed it at every turn, in law, in commerce, in the sermons of the church he attended, in the casual language of every social interaction he had ever participated in. He was a man who had never once been required to genuinely question whether the foundation of his prosperity was a crime. This particular type of person, the unquestioning inheritor, is in many ways more difficult to write about than the outright villain. The outright villain has clarity, at least. You know where you stand with him. Edmund Whitmore occupied a more ambiguous and ultimately more common space, the space of the ordinary man embedded in an extraordinary system of evil, performing his role without malice and without reflection. His wife, Catherine Whitmore, was younger by about 15 years. She was the daughter of Thomas Hargrove. I'll let that land for a second. Yes, Thomas Hargrove, the same man who had visited Dorothea Eames on Wednesday evenings and brought sweets for little Celia and called her "my little bird." He had married Carolyn Fells in 1835, and they had had one daughter, Catherine. Catherine had grown up in that house on Spruce Street in Philadelphia. She had never known about Dorothea, had never known about Wednesday evenings, had never known she had a half-sister working the indigo fields of South Carolina. And neither woman knew the other existed. Not yet. Catherine Whitmore was not a cruel woman by nature. This is worth saying clearly, because history has a way of flattening the people in it into simple villains and heroes, and the real horror of what happened at Whitmore Plantation, the real moral weight of it, only lands properly if you understand that most of the people in this story were not monsters. They were people caught in a monstrous system, playing roles the system had assigned them, doing what the system told them was normal.
Catherine was strict with the house slaves. She kept close track of the silver and the linens and the china. She believed in what she'd been taught to believe, that the natural order of things had placed her where she was and placed others where they were, and that this was simply how the world was arranged. She was not given to reflection on the matter. She went to church on Sundays, she embroidered, she managed the household accounts. She was, in the language of her world, a good wife and a competent mistress of the house. She also had a small birthmark on her left shoulder, a port wine stain, dark reddish purple, roughly the size and shape of a crescent moon. She'd had it since birth. Her mother had called it her little moon. It was not particularly remarkable as birthmarks go, a private feature, the kind of thing you'd only know about if you were very close to someone. Now, Celia didn't work in the main house, not at first. For her first 3 years at Whitmore, she was in the fields. Grueling work, hot and endless, the kind of labor designed to reduce a person to their most purely physical existence. But Celia was still thinking, still watching, still building that interior garden. She had befriended an older woman, perhaps the most important person in this story after Celia herself, named Mamie. Mamie had been at Whitmore Plantation for 30 years. She'd seen children born and sold away, had buried 2 husbands, had weathered every season of that place with a deep, gnarled endurance that came not from having accepted her situation, but from having decided, somewhere along the way, that love was the only act of resistance that truly could not be taken from her. Mamie loved people fiercely and practically. She learned what they needed, and she provided it when she could. She was the nearest thing to a doctor on the plantation, knew roots and herbs and the right words to say to a frightened person in the dark. It is worth pausing here to talk about people like Mamie, because history has not treated them as well as it should.
We talk a great deal about the heroism of those who escaped, the Frederick Douglasses, the Harriet Tubmans, the people who ran and got free and told their stories to the world, and that heroism is real and enormous and deserving of every honor. But there is another kind of heroism that gets far less attention, the heroism of those who stayed, who could not run because of age or children or injury or the specific terrible geography of their situation, and who chose, within the impossible constraints of staying, to make things as survivable as possible for the people around them. Mamie was one of those people. She had not chosen to stay in some abstract sense. She had not chosen slavery, obviously. She had been given no choice in the matter of her presence at Whitmore. But within that forced presence, she had made 1,000 smaller choices, each one deliberate and costly and quiet. She had chosen to learn which plants would reduce a fever and which would make it worse. She had chosen to remember every person who had come through the plantation and been sold away, to keep their names, their faces, their small particularities alive in her memory and in the memories of those she told. She had chosen again and again to be present for the grief of others when it would have been easier to wall herself off. She was, in the language of the plantation system, invisible. She was a middle-aged black woman doing domestic labor in the slave quarters. No one wrote about her. No one tracked her influence. Her choices left no paper trail. But look at what she did. She kept Celia alive. Not physically, though she helped with that too, the extra cornbread, the medicine, but in the interior sense. She gave Celia a person to be honest with. And in a world designed to erase the self, having one person to be honest with is the difference between survival and dissolution. She noticed Celia immediately, noticed the walnut stain on her hands that never quite matched the rest of her, the way Celia's eyes read things, signs, notices, even the backs of crates, with a fluency that the field workers rarely possessed. Noticed the Philadelphia accent that Celia had largely buried, but which surfaced in unguarded moments. Mamie said nothing. She simply began to sit near Celia in the evenings, brought her extra cornbread when she could, let the silence between them stretch until Celia was ready to fill it. It took 2 years, 2 full years of Mamie's patient, wordless proximity before Celia spoke honestly about who she was. And when she did, on a cool autumn night in 1844, sitting behind the smokehouse with the stars thick overhead, Mamie listened to the whole story without interruption. When she finished, Mamie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "I wondered when you'd be ready to say it out loud." "You knew?" Celia asked. "I suspected," Mamie said. "There's a way a person carries freedom in their body, even when everything else has been taken. You can see it if you know what to look for, like a scar from a light that was put out." That line, a scar from a light that was put out, became something Celia carried with her for the rest of her life. Because it was true. That's exactly what it felt like. That's exactly what she was. Now in 1845, 3 years into her time at Whitmore, Celia was moved from the fields to the main house. The reason was practical. The previous laundrywoman had died from a fever, and someone was needed who could work quickly and handle fine fabrics. Celia had learned to sew from her mother. She was precise and careful. She was promoted, in the language of that world, to housework. This was, on one hand, an improvement in physical conditions. On the other hand, it placed her in proximity to Catherine every single day. And here is where the story begins to tighten, where the threads begin to pull toward each other. Working in the house, Celia noticed things, small things. The portrait above the parlor mantelpiece of Catherine's father, the same man whose face Celia had known from childhood, older now, painted in oils and respectability, but unmistakably Thomas Hargrove. The cold ripple that went through her the first time she saw it. She said nothing, showed nothing, just filed it away in the part of herself where she kept everything important. She noticed the way Catherine touched the birthmark on her shoulder sometimes, absently when she was thinking, the way people touch a familiar scar. She noticed that Catherine had the same particular habit as Celia herself, tilting her head very slightly to the left when she was concentrating on something.
She noticed that when Catherine hummed to herself while doing needlework, the tune was a particular French lullaby, a simple, lilting song that Dorothea had hummed to Celia in Philadelphia. This last detail stopped Celia cold the first time she heard it. She stood in the doorway of the parlor with a stack of folded linens in her arms, and the sound of that melody coming from Catherine Whitmore's lips was so specific, so precisely the same tune, that for a moment the world seemed to tip sideways. This last detail stopped Celia cold the first time she heard it. She stood in the doorway of the parlor with a stack of folded linens in her arms, and the sound of that melody coming from Catherine Whitmore's lips was so specific, so precisely the same tune, that for a moment the world seemed to tip sideways. It was possible that it was a common song. It was possible that many people knew it. But the particular phrasing, the way Catherine dropped the third note just slightly, the way Dorothea had always dropped it, was too specific to be coincidence. Celia did not speak. She set down the linens, and she walked back to the kitchen, and she stood over the wash-tub for a very long time, and then she got back to work. Because what could she possibly do with that knowledge? She was enslaved. She had no papers. She had no proof. And even if she'd had both those things, even if she could have walked into the parlor and said clearly, "Your father is my father, and your birthmark is my birthmark, and the song you are humming was sung to me first," what then? What would a world built on the premise of her inferiority possibly do with the truth of her humanity? She kept it inside. She kept it with all the other things she kept inside. Dorothea's face, the Wednesday evenings, the smell of the market in Philadelphia, the sound of her own name said with love. Now I need to tell you about James. James was 25 years old, tall and deliberate in his movements, with a deep voice and a tendency toward long silences that made other people nervous, but that Celia found restful. He worked as a carpenter on the plantation, skilled work, which gave him slightly more freedom of movement than the field laborers. He and Celia had begun talking in the evenings by the well, conversations that started as practical and became, gradually, the kind of conversations that carry the full weight of a life. He knew about her. She had told him, as she had told Mamie. He was the third person in 6 years she had trusted with the truth of herself. That small number tells you something about the world she was living in, about the cost of trust in a place built on betrayal. James loved Celia quietly and without conditions. He didn't love the idea of her, didn't love the story of the free girl from Philadelphia, the tragedy of the stolen papers and the market abduction. He loved her specifically, the particular way she went still when she was angry, the way she laughed in short, surprised bursts, as if laughter always caught her off guard, the way she folded cloth with the same precision her mother had taught her, making every crease exact. He loved the real person inside the survival. And for Celia, being loved like that, being seen and loved in her specificity, was both the greatest comfort of those years and the greatest source of anguish. Because every good thing in a life of bondage also deepens the terror of losing it. James was 25 years old, tall and deliberate in his movements, with a deep voice and a tendency toward long silences that made other people nervous, but that Celia found restful. He worked as a carpenter on the plantation, skilled work, which gave him slightly more freedom of movement than the field laborers. He and Celia had begun talking in the evenings by the well, conversations that started as practical and became, gradually, the kind of conversations that carry the full weight of a life. Their courtship, if you can call it that in a place where the word implies a freedom they did not possess, was conducted entirely in small, careful exchanges. A comment about the weather, a question about a plant Celia had noticed, James asking her once, quite suddenly and without preamble, whether she thought the stars were the same stars you saw in the north. Celia thinking about this seriously before answering, yes, she believed they were, and there being something in that exchange, the seriousness of the question, the seriousness of her engagement with it, that told both of them they had found someone worth talking to. He was born in Georgia, had been sold to Whitmore when he was 12 years old. He had no memory of his father. His mother had died of a fever when he was 9. He had been, by the time Celia arrived, self-sufficient in the deepest sense, a man who had learned to require very little from the world outside himself, because the world outside himself had demonstrated its unreliability so thoroughly and so early. He was not bitter about this. He was just accurate. He had the particular kind of internal stillness that comes from having made peace, not with injustice, but with the fact of one's own continuity regardless of injustice. He was still here. Whatever had been done to him, he had remained. He knew about her. She had told him, as she had told Mamie. He was the third person in 6 years she had trusted with the truth of herself. That small number tells you something about the world she was living in, about the cost of trust in a place built on betrayal. James loved Celia quietly and without conditions. He didn't love the idea of her, didn't love the story of the free girl from Philadelphia, the tragedy of the stolen papers and the market abduction. He loved her specifically, the particular way she went still when she was angry, the way she laughed in short, surprised bursts, as if laughter always caught her off guard, the way she folded cloth with the same precision her mother had taught her, making every crease exact. He loved the real person inside the survival. And for Celia, being loved like that, being seen and loved in her specificity, was both the greatest comfort of those years and the greatest source of anguish. Because every good thing in a life of bondage also deepens the terror of losing it. And I think that's what I want to leave you with. Not the drama of the revelation, though the revelation is real and remarkable. Not the legal victory or the memoir or the record that survived. Those things matter enormously. But underneath all of them is this. A young woman from Philadelphia sitting behind a smokehouse on a cool autumn night, telling the truth about herself to someone who was patient enough to wait for it. That's the core of this story. That's where everything starts. Not with storms or birthmarks or legal papers, with a person saying to another person who was genuinely listening, "This is who I am." History is full of people who kept things, who held their truths inside them through impossible conditions, who maintained their interior gardens through decades of winter, who wrote things down in the faith that the right hands would eventually find them, who hummed songs to themselves in the dark that their mothers had taught them, who held tin boxes under floorboards and left doors open before the knock. Their stories are worth telling, every single one of them, and not because they survived, because survival is not by itself the measure of a life's worth, but because they were here, because they were real, because the truth of a person, witnessed or unwitnessed, recorded or unrecorded, is not diminished by the world's failure to see it. It was there. It was always there. It persisted, because the truth of a person is sufficient. It was always, always sufficient.